Thanks, Joko. Ed Vaizey, this Mr Osborne's punishment budget, if we vote to leave, it's crashed and burned on takeoff, hasn't it?
Well, I don't think it's a punishment budget. I think what George Osborne is doing is he's making a very important point, which is a point really that we have to get across, that we know that there will be an economic shock if we leave the European Union. Every credible analysis of the economy says that there will be a significant impact on our economy. This is really very serious stuff.
How big did the Treasury... How big did the Treasury say the impact would be?
George's budget proposal sets out the kind of changes you would have to see to fill that hole.
How big did the Treasury say the impact would be in its short-term report? What was its central forecast?
What the Institute of Fiscal Studies
No, I've asked you about the Treasury because that's your government's department.
What the Institute of Fiscal Studies
But excuse me, I asked you about apples, you answer about oranges. Let me try again.
Well,
tell me what was the central forecast for recession in the Treasury short-term report.
What I'm telling you is that this budget that George Osborne is setting out with Alistair Darling is based on the Institute of Fiscal Studies estimate, which is a £20 to £40 billion impact on the public finances. And George has quite rightly taken a mid-range, 30 billion. If there is to be a mid-range impact on the public finances, this is what it would mean.
The Treasury said the economy...
increase taxes, and it would mean having to cut spending.
The Treasury said that the economy would go down by 0.4% over a year. Now, nobody wants it to go down at all, obviously. But why does a reduction, a recession, and shallow recession, the shallowest since 1956, of 0.4%, result in this massive punishment in tax rises and spending cuts amounting to 30 billion? Explain that.
Well, you're using this word punishment. What George Osborne and Alistair Darling are doing, united together, the first time they've spoken together as one on a public platform, is to say there will be an impact on the public finances, and when a Chancellor sees the impact on the public finances, he or she has to act, and they have to make very tough decisions, and those tough decisions will include raising taxes or cutting spending.
I was trying to work out why this response would be required, given how shallow the Treasury said the recession would be.
In terms of the impact, you've seen, for example, Rolls-Royce today saying, talking about the potential impact on Brexit, one of our most successful manufacturing companies. You've seen BT yesterday telling its 80,000 employees the kind of impact that it would have. I think the real point here, Andrew, is, you know, you can bring up different surveys and say, well, what about this and that?
Well, I didn't. I only brought up the Treasury.
Everybody knows, the two key points are, everybody knows there will be an economic shock. And what George Osborne is saying, the second key point, is that means there will have to be an emergency budget where we will have to address levels of spending and levels of taxes to get the budget back on track.
How would you get that emergency budget through? There's not a majority in the Commons for it.
Well, we've had the letter. I haven't seen all the names, but obviously...
57 Conservative MPs described Mr Osborne's position as, quote, untenable. There is no majority in Parliament for this budget, therefore the budget wouldn't get through.
Well, what George Osborne is saying is this is the kind of budget that you would have to expect if we leave. I think it's a perfectly valid thing for a Chancellor, somebody who's been Chancellor for 6 years, who's seen us through an economic crisis. You know, unemployment fell again today.
Now, I understand
a lot of what George Osborne has done
Please address my
put the
point.
economy back on track.
You only have a majority of under 16. At times it's only 12. 57 Tory MPs and rising regard this threat as untenable. They will not vote for it. They've warned you. Labour's not going to vote for it. I assume we'll find out in a minute from John Mann. You could not get this budget through. It's an empty threat.
It's not an empty threat. It's a credible example.
How would you get it through Parliament?
The kind of changes you would have to make if we left. Well, Parliament, after a leave vote, if there is a, God forbid, a leave vote, Parliament will have to reconvene. The Chancellor will have to set out what he thinks the risks are going to be.
He won't be Chancellor, will he?
On the public finances. And then there will have to be a budget proposed by the Chancellor.
He won't be Chancellor.
And at that point, MPs will have to very much decide what their duty is. Is their duty to help get the economy back on track, given the economic shock of leaving the economic union? Could you explain the logic? Or is it simply to say, well, we're just going to be a roadblock?
Could you explain the economic logic? Or give me any major economist in the world would think this is a response. That if we are heading to recession as a result of leaving, which is the Chancellor's scenario, we're going into recession, what is the economic logic as a recession stares us in the face that we raise tax and cut spending?
Well, as I said earlier, the Chancellor is someone who's stewarded the public finances for the last 6 years. We see one of those results today with the 20,000 fall in unemployment.
What's the economic logic?
We've seen long-term unemployment fall significantly, and that's because he did get the public finances.
But what is the economic logic of raising taxes and cutting spending as we're heading into a recession?
I'm about to tell you, he balanced the budgets over the last 6 years, well, at least significantly reduced our deficit.
He's balanced the budget.
Significantly reduced our deficit.
What's the size of the deficit?
He had to raise some taxes, and he had to cut.
He slowed down the spending. He said he would. Excuse me, Ed Vaizey, you can't be allowed. You may be rewriting the future. We won't know till we reach there, but you can't be allowed to rewrite the past. He actually slowed down the spending cuts because we were in recession, and instead of balancing the budget by 2015, which was his promise, he gave us an £80 billion deficit. So I ask again, can you name any credible economist, because Remain is very keen to quote mainstream economists, who would think that slashing spending and increasing tax would be a credible response to a recession?
Well, no doubt economists might pile in after this, as they've piled in on this whole issue of whether we should leave the European Union.
Well, give me one.
And when I was last on this programme, you asked Kate Hoey to name any credible economist who could say that leaving the European Union would be good for our economy.
So you're bringing up Kate Hoey. Well, I'm asking you. I'm asking you. Can you name?
Well, I'm asking the European Union would be good for our economy.
I am asking you. Can you name an economist? Can you name an economist that thinks this would be a proper reaction? Don't try and filibuster. You did it before, and it didn't go down too well. Just answer this question. Name an economist that thinks the Osborne's punishment budget would be the correct response. Well, just name one.
Well, you know full well over the last 6 years when George took decisions...
So you can't. Just admit
when George took decisions about cutting spending and raising taxes, organisations like the IMF told him he was playing with fire.
That's the IMF and you're now calling aid of Remain.
They came round and said, actually, what George Osborne did was correct.
Let me see if I can get an answer to this question, because it will be a first. In the manifesto, you promised a referendum. You also promised more money for the NHS. You also promised not to raise VAT or income tax or national insurance. But you never anywhere said in the manifesto, but we can't keep any of these promises if you vote to leave in the referendum. So it was a false prospectus, wasn't it?
Well, prospectus was to hold a referendum, which is a manifesto promise that we fulfilled.
No, I've said
that. In terms of the current state of the economy and our ability to manage that economy with the situation as it is now, with us as a member of the European Union, trading freely with a market of 500 million, we can do the things we've done.
But you never told us that all these promises
might change.
But you never told us that. There is nowhere in the manifesto do you say that all these major promises are predicated on us voting, in your view, the right way on the referendum. That's true, isn't it?
Well, there are key issues in the manifesto that you can't foresee, because, for example, David Cameron still had to carry out his very successful negotiation in Brussels.
You could foresee this because you promised a manifesto. It was in the manifesto.
Some of the key
changes you promised a referendum
that have secured our vision for Britain in the European Union.
John Mann, is there any chance that the Labour Party, whether it's on your side of Leave or majority for Remain, would vote for a budget like this post the referendum?
Well, as John McDonnell has put out this morning, no. This budget won't be voted through. It's not a proposed budget, it's a press stunt by George Osborne, and rather a silly one.
So John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, says Labour won't vote. Labour would be whipped against it, I assume. There'd be no rebels. I think we can take it for granted the SNP, which is the self-designated anti-austerity party, they would vote against it. Almost 60 Tory MPs and rising would vote against it. It's a nonsense. Ed Vaizey.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were still asking John. I'm getting all the questions. Well, I mean, I've already made the point that
this you don't get it through, that's the point. How would you get it through?
This is an example budget. Well, the Chancellor would come to the Commons after a Leave vote, when people would see the reality, if they, as I said earlier, God forbid there was a Leave vote, would see the reality, would see the impact on the economy, and then the Commons would have to take a view on whether it is important to get the budget back on track, to get the national finances back on track, given the new and very dangerous situation we're in.
John Mann, why was Alistair Darling associating himself with this morning?
Desperation, I think. Last attempt to shore up the vote. I'm hearing that even in Scotland, that the vote in many constituencies may well be going for Leave, even in Scotland.
That would be a surprise.
But that's what I'm hearing.
So
from people in Scotland.
Just to check though, Alistair Darling then was not representing the Labour Party this morning, to your understanding?
Well, it clearly wasn't. If it was someone representing the Labour Party, it would have been John McDonnell as the
So he
Shadow
was
Chancellor.
representing Alistair Darling?
He was indeed, and a very good man he's been, but, you know, his judgment on this is wrong. And linking with this, it's desperate politics trying to build up this project fair even more. It's not working. And it's not working because it's nonsense, and this is kind of almost the classic illustration of what nonsense it is.
And yet the Chancellor this morning on the BBC radio implied that there was quite a consensus, it was a common view, and he used Alistair Darling's position there, of Labour and Conservatives said the same thing. We've just heard now from John Mann. Ed Vaizey, I'm asking you. I know you don't want me to, but that's why I'm continuing.
I feel it's a bit unbalanced.
Well, you're the one with the questions to answer at the moment. That he implied that this was a common view. He made the point of saying here we have a former Labour Chancellor, Conservative Chancellor. There is a broad view that this is what we would have to do. And we've now heard from the Shadow Chancellor that they wouldn't vote for this. It's as I said, I began by saying, it's crashed and burned on takeoff.
Well, I think what he was doing was standing with a Labour Chancellor in the last Labour government, when Labour used to win elections, who had to handle an economy in crisis following the banking crash. So I think Alistair Darling is a credible figure who knows what it's like when you're sitting in number 11 Downing Street and facing an economic shock. But he's sitting with a man who's looked at what George is proposing.
But he was not speaking for anybody but himself,
correct? My experience, this is exactly what I would expect. Look, I don't know what John McDonnell's position is.
We've just been told.
There is this peculiar.
We've just been told.
There is this peculiar mindset, I gather, from Jeremy Corbyn that he won't share a platform with the Conservatives. But the fact is, there is a united front across Labour,
but they won't
the majority of Conservative MPs and the SNP that our economic future,
they won't vote for an austerity
our economic
budget.
future lies in Europe, and that is a key.
But not just not vote for an austerity budget. If you look at what Jonathan Portes has said in the last
from the
hour,
NIESR.
He's an economist who is in favour with Jeremy and John McDonnell, I think it's fair to say. He said, do exactly the opposite. If the scenario is what George Osborne's saying, do exactly the opposite. And so, in fact, the John McDonnell budget would be reflating the economy,
right,
as opposed to
let's have a look at what the Vote Leave have presented today in terms of their Queen's Speech-style blueprint, which I outlined a little bit earlier. I mean, one of the announcements includes proposals for a bill that would provide an extra £100 million a week to the NHS. Why not the £350 million that you've been talking about?
Well, I mean, Vote Leave aren't in power, and you know, one of the interesting things with this referendum is there's two debates going on. There's the Remain and Vote Leave battle on the media, of course, because they're the representatives, and there's the discussions that are going on in the rest of the country. And in the discussions in the rest of the country, all of this, frankly, is passing them by.
Right, so do you think that this Queen's Speech-style blueprint wasn't worth doing for Vote Leave?
I think that one thing that's certain is now that there'll be more money spent on the NHS if we leave, because there's a consensus, perhaps for the first time.
But would it be £100 million or the £350 million that Vote Leave keep quoting as the amount of money that is spent and sent to Brussels every week?
Well, it all depends who's in power and who makes the decision.
Right.
There will be money.
What would you do?
What would I do? I would be looking to spend sufficient money, which would be under 100 million, on putting money back into the NHS, getting rid of the hospital deficits, recruiting nurses, getting nurses bursaries, even giving a pay increase in the NHS, putting money back into the National Health Service would be my priority. And if that money becomes available, that's what I would be.
All right, but you think this is an alternative manifesto, and at the moment they shouldn't be putting this forward. Let's have a look at Labour on immigration, because you've talked a lot about immigration. It does look as if Labour is panicking as much as the Conservatives. We've had Tom Watson, the deputy leader, now say there would be moves, proposals to curb the free movement of people. I presume you'd agree with him on that.
I've called for that. I called for it in the negotiations that David Cameron did. I called for it immediately after the election. I called for it in the last Parliament a lot. But the problem is that you can't do it because the European Union refuses to do it.
So on whose authority is he saying it?
He's saying it in terms of what's good for the country, and I agree with him.
But not the Labour Party, because it's not what Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell think, is it?
Well, You'd have to ask Tom Watson. I'm not privy to their discussions, but I agree with the principle of what Tom Watson and Michael Duggar and others have said. However, the problem with that is that the European Union rules don't allow it to happen. And so the issue for all of us is going to be, whatever the vote, what do we do afterwards on the Friday? And if it's leave, we have that opportunity.
Right.